Captain Sarah Martinez pressed her back against the concrete barrier, dust and debris raining down from the latest explosion. The acrid smell of burning fuel and cordite filled her nostrils as she checked her watch. 3 hours since the ambush began, and her unit was pinned down in what should have been a routine patrol through the industrial district. She peered over the barrier, observing the enemy positions. 6 tanks had rolled into the area, cutting off all escape routes. Their heavy armor gleamed menacingly in the afternoon sun, main guns swiveling to track any movement from her trapped soldiers. The sound of diesel engines mixed with the occasional crack of sniper fire from the surrounding buildings. "Commander, the rocket launcher system is completely fried," Sergeant Mike Chin reported, crawling over with his equipment pack. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat, eyes reflecting the frustration they all felt. "Took a direct hit from shrapnel during that first barrage. Circuit board looks like someone took a sledgehammer to it." Sarah examined the damaged equipment. The digital display showed nothing but static, and several components had been completely severed. This was their primary anti-tank weapon, designed specifically to neutralize the kind of heavy armor they now faced. Without it, her 30-person unit had little hope against 6 main battle tanks. "What about backup systems?" she asked, though she suspected the answer. "Negative, ma'am. The electromagnetic pulse from that first explosion knocked out most of our electronic equipment. Radio's working on emergency power, but everything else is dead or dying." Chun gestured toward their position. "We got small arms, grenades, and whatever explosives we can improvise, but against that kind of armor." Sarah nodded grimly. Her mind raced through tactical options, each one seeming more impossible than the last. The enemy had chosen their ambush site perfectly. The industrial complex was surrounded by open ground on 3 sides, with the 4th blocked by a river too wide and fast across under fire. The tanks were positioned to cover all approaches, their supporting infantry holding the high ground in the factory buildings. A young private, barely 19 years old, slid up beside them. "Ma'am, we've got wounded. Phillips took shrapnel in the leg, and Rodriguez is unconscious from a concussion blast. They need medical attention soon." The weight of command pressed down on Sarah's shoulders. These were her soldiers, her responsibility. She had led them into this situation following intelligence reports that turned out to be fatally flawed. The enemy had been waiting, prepared, organized. Now 30 lives depended on her ability to find a way out of an impossible situation. She studied the enemy positions again, noting patterns in their movement and positioning. The lead tank, a massive vehicle with reactive armor plating, sat at the entrance to the main road. Its commander was visible in the cupola, scanning their position with binoculars. Behind it, 2 more tanks covered the flanks while the remaining 3 held back in reserve positions. "Chun, how much C4 do we have left?" she asked quietly. "Maybe 6 charges, ma'am. Enough to take out a building or 2, but not nearly enough to penetrate tank armor from the outside." Sarah's eyes moved to the factory complex behind the enemy position. Massive concrete structures rose 4 stories high, their windows dark and empty. Decades of industrial use had left the buildings sturdy but showing their age. Steam pipes ran between structures, and she could see the outline of heavy machinery through broken windows. An idea began forming in her mind, dangerous and desperate, but potentially their only chance. She pulled out a sketch pad and began drawing quickly, her engineering background from before military service coming into focus. The factory layout, enemy positions, and potential approach routes took shape on paper. "Ma'am," Chin said, noticing her intense concentration, "you're thinking something crazy, aren't you?" Sarah almost smiled despite their situation. Chin had served under her for 2 years and knew her tendency toward unconventional solutions. "Crazy enough that it might work," she admitted. "But I need to get closer to those tanks first. Study their positioning and movement patterns." "Absolutely not, Commander. You're not going out there alone. I'm not asking for permission, Sergeant. I'm giving you an order to hold this position and keep our people alive while I gather intelligence." She handed him the radio. "If I don't make it back in 2 hours, try to negotiate a surrender. Get the wounded medical attention. Chen's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Military discipline ward with personal loyalty in his expression. At least take someone with you for backup. No, one person can move quietly and avoid detection. Two or more becomes a tactical operation that we don't have the resources to support properly. Sarah checked her sidearm and knife, leaving behind anything that might create noise or reflection. I need to understand how they're thinking, how they're positioned, what their weaknesses might be. The factory whistle that had once called workers to their shifts still stood at the center of the complex, its rusty metal framework rising above the surrounding buildings. From there, she would have a clear view of the entire battlefield and enemy deployment. More importantly, she might be able to identify structural weaknesses in the buildings that could be exploited. As Sarah prepared to leave their defensive position, she thought about the intelligence briefing that had led them here. Reports of enemy supply movements through this sector, described as lightly defended and routine. The reality was obviously a carefully planned trap, but that meant the enemy wanted something specific from this engagement. They weren't just trying to eliminate her unit. They were trying to capture territory or resources. Chen, what's the most valuable target in this industrial complex? She asked suddenly. The sergeant consulted his tactical map. According to our briefing, there's a water treatment facility that serves 3 surrounding towns. Also some kind of chemical processing plant that was supposedly shut down last year. Sarah studied the map more carefully. The water treatment facility would be a strategic target, but the chemical plant interested her more. If it had been shut down recently, there might still be useful materials inside. Industrial chemicals could be repurposed into explosive devices with the right knowledge and equipment. I'm changing the plan slightly, she announced. I'll gather intelligence on enemy positions, but I'm also going to investigate that chemical plant. If there's anything useful inside, it might give us options we don't currently have. Chen looked worried. Ma'am, abandoned chemical plants can be dangerous even when they're not in a war zone. Unknown substances, unstable compounds, contaminated air. I'll be careful, but right now, dangerous chemicals are less of a threat than those tanks. Sarah secured her equipment and checked the time again. 2 hours, Sergeant. If I'm not back, you know what to do. She moved toward the edge of their defensive position, staying low and using the concrete barriers for cover. The enemy snipers were watching for movement, but they were focused primarily on obvious escape routes. Sarah had identified a drainage ditch that ran parallel to their position for about 200 meters before curving toward the factory complex. The ditch was partially filled with stagnant water and debris from years of neglect, but it provided concealment from direct observation. Sarah slipped over the barrier and into the murky water, immediately feeling the cold seep through her uniform. The smell was terrible, a mixture of industrial runoff and organic decay, but it was cover. Moving through the ditch required patience and careful timing. Every few meters, she stopped to listen for enemy movement and observe the tank positions from her low vantage point. The sound of diesel engines provided some audio camouflage, but she knew that modern tanks had sophisticated detection equipment that could identify heat signatures or movement patterns. After 20 minutes of careful progress, Sarah reached the point where the drainage ditch curved toward the factory complex. Here, she faced her greatest risk, crossing 50 meters of open ground to reach the first building. The tanks couldn't see this approach angle directly, but infantry spotters in the upper floors might detect movement. She waited for a cloud to pass over the sun, reducing visibility slightly, then sprinted across the open space in short bursts. Dash, stop, observe, dash again. Her heart pounded as she anticipated the crack of sniper fire or the roar of a tank engine turning to engage her position. But no shots came. Sarah reached the wall of the first factory building and pressed herself against the aged concrete, breathing hard but undetected. Now came the more technical part of her mission, understanding the enemy deployment and finding potential weapons in the chemical plant. The factory building showed decades of industrial use. Windows were broken or boarded up, and metal fire escapes provided access to upper floors. Sarah chose a side entrance that was partially hidden by overgrown vegetation and carefully tested the door. It opened with a rusty squeal that made her freeze, listening for any response from enemy forces. Inside, the building was dark and filled with the echoes of machinery that had operated here for generations. Massive conveyor systems stretched between floors, and the smell of machine oil mixed with dust and decay. Sarah made her way toward a stairwell, moving carefully to avoid creating noise that might carry outside. From the third floor, she had an excellent view of the enemy tank positions. Through a broken window, she could see the lead tank clearly, its commander still visible in the cupola. The crew appeared relaxed but alert, confident in their tactical superiority. Behind the main position, she counted additional infantry moving between buildings and setting up defensive positions of their own. Sarah realized that the enemy was preparing for a prolonged engagement. They weren't planning to simply destroy her unit and move on. They intended to hold this position for an extended period. That suggested the industrial complex had strategic value beyond what her briefing had indicated. She sketched the enemy positions quickly, noting fields of fire, blind spots, and potential approach routes. The tanks were well positioned for defense, but might be vulnerable to attacks from unexpected directions. More importantly, their positioning assumed that any assault would come from conventional angles using conventional weapons. After documenting the enemy deployment, Sarah made her way toward the chemical processing plant. The building was larger and more isolated than the others, with warning signs in multiple languages posted around the entrances. Despite being officially shut down, some of the warning lights were still functioning, casting an eerie red glow in the gathering dusk. The main entrance was secured with heavy chains and warning signs about hazardous materials, but Sarah found a maintenance access panel that had been left unlocked. Inside, the chemical plant was a maze of pipes, tanks, and processing equipment. Emergency lighting provided minimal illumination, creating strange shadows between the industrial machinery. Sarah's engineering background helped her identify different systems and their potential purposes. She found storage tanks labeled with chemical formulas and hazard symbols, processing equipment designed for mixing and refining operations, and control systems that appear to have been hastily shut down rather than properly decommissioned. In a storage room near the main processing area, she discovered exactly what she had hoped for: containers of industrial chemicals that could be repurposed for military applications. Ammonium nitrate for fertilizer production, various acids and solvents, and even some explosive compounds used for industrial blasting operations. But more importantly, she found detailed schematics of the factory's infrastructure. Water systems, electrical grids, steam distribution networks, and structural support systems were all documented in engineering drawings that had been left behind when the plant was abandoned. These documents revealed something the enemy probably didn't know. The entire complex was built on a foundation of interconnected tunnels and service passages. Sarah studied the schematics by flashlight, her mind racing as she understood the possibilities. The tunnel system connected all the major buildings in the complex and extended under the area where the enemy tanks were positioned. If she could access these tunnels with the right equipment, she might be able to attack the tanks from below, where their armor was thinnest. But the plan would require precise timing, considerable technical skill, and a level of risk that went far beyond normal military operations. She would essentially be conducting a one-person demolition mission against overwhelming enemy forces, using improvised explosives in an unstable environment. Sarah gathered the chemical containers she could carry and photographed the most important engineering documents with a small camera from her equipment kit. The tunnel access points were marked on the schematics, and she identified the one closest to the main enemy tank position. As she prepared to leave the chemical plant, Sarah heard the sound of approaching vehicles outside. Through a window, she could see additional enemy forces arriving: supply trucks, personnel carriers, and what appeared to be a mobile command unit. The enemy was reinforcing their position, confirming her suspicion that they planned to hold this ground for strategic purposes. The situation was becoming more desperate by the hour, but Sarah now had information and resources that might change the tactical equation. She carefully concealed the chemical containers in a maintenance room where she could retrieve them later, then began her return journey to her unit's position. The return trip through the drainage ditch was more difficult in the growing darkness, but it provided better concealment from enemy observation. Sarah moved quickly but carefully, knowing that her soldiers were counting on her to return with a viable plan for survival. When she finally reached their defensive position, Chun immediately moved to help her over the barrier. "Ma'am, thank God you made it back. We were starting to worry about the timeline." Sarah quickly briefed her senior sergeants on what she had discovered: enemy reinforcements, the tunnel system, available chemical materials, and the strategic importance of the complex. As she outlined her preliminary plan for using the tunnels to attack the tanks from below, she saw the mixture of hope and concern in their faces. "It's extremely dangerous," she concluded honestly. "The chances of success are probably less than 50%, and if something goes wrong, I might not make it back. But it's the only realistic chance we have of neutralizing those tanks and getting our people out alive." Sergeant Chun was quiet for a long moment, processing the information. "Ma'am, what do you need from us to make this work?" "Time, distraction, and precise timing on the detonation sequence. I'll need to rig explosives in multiple tunnel locations to create a coordinated attack that takes out several tanks simultaneously." Sarah showed them the engineering diagrams she had photographed. "This isn't just about destroying one tank. It's about creating enough chaos and damage to break their entire defensive position." The soldiers around her looked at the plans with a mixture of admiration and worry. They understood that their commander was proposing something far beyond standard military doctrine, but they also understood that conventional approaches had already failed. As night fell over the industrial complex, Sarah began the detailed planning phase of what would either be a brilliant tactical victory or a catastrophic final gamble. Either way, by dawn, the situation would be resolved one way or another. Sarah spread the tunnel schematics across the concrete floor of their makeshift command post, using her flashlight to illuminate the engineering drawings. Her senior staff gathered around, studying the complex network of maintenance passages that ran beneath the entire industrial facility. The weight of their desperate situation hung heavy in the air, but for the first time since the ambush began, they had something resembling a plan. These service tunnels were designed for maintenance access to the steam distribution system, Sarah explained, tracing routes with her finger. "They're large enough for a person to move through, and they connect directly under the main enemy tank positions. More importantly, they were built to withstand industrial accidents, so they should remain stable even if we detonate explosives above them." Sergeant Chun studied the diagrams carefully, his experience with demolitions evident in how he analyzed the structural details. "The access points are here, here, and here," he said, marking 3 locations on the map. "But, ma'am, getting to these tunnels means crossing enemy-controlled territory, and once you're down there, you'll be completely cut off from communication and support." Sarah nodded grimly. "That's why the timing has to be perfect. I'll need exactly 3 hours to reach the chemical plant, prepare the explosives, navigate the tunnel system, and position charges under the tank positions. At precisely 0400 hours, you'll need to create a diversion that draws their attention away from the tunnel entrances." Corporal Lisa Wagner, their communications specialist, looked up from the radio equipment. "Ma'am, we can coordinate with artillery support from Firebase Delta. They're about 20 kilometers out, but they could provide covering fire during the critical phase of the operation." "No," Sarah said firmly. "This has to be a completely self-contained operation. Any outside support would alert the enemy that something larger is happening, and they'd start looking for infiltration attempts. We need them focused on conventional threats from conventional directions." She turned her attention to the improvised explosive devices they would need to construct. The chemicals she had discovered in the processing plant could be combined with their remaining military explosives to create charges powerful enough to penetrate tank armor from below. But the mixing process required precise measurements and careful handling of extremely dangerous materials. Chun, I need you to select 2 volunteers to help with the explosive preparation, Sarah instructed. They need to understand that this is probably a one-way mission. If something goes wrong during the mixing process or tunnel placement, there might not be time for evacuation. The sergeant's expression was troubled, but he nodded. Ma'am, I volunteer to go with you. This kind of operation shouldn't be conducted alone. Absolutely not. I need you here to coordinate the diversion and manage the evacuation if the plan succeeds. If it fails, you'll need to negotiate surrender terms that protect our wounded soldiers. Sarah's voice carried the absolute authority of command, but Chun could hear the emotional weight behind her words. As they refined the operational details, Sarah found herself thinking about the enemy commander who had orchestrated this ambush. The tactical positioning was too sophisticated for a routine engagement. This had been planned specifically to trap her unit and eliminate them systematically. That suggested intelligence leaks or betrayal at a higher level, but understanding the political implications would have to wait until they survived the immediate tactical situation. Private Rodriguez, still groggy from his concussion, but insisting on remaining functional, approached their planning group. Ma'am, I've been monitoring enemy radio traffic. They're expecting reinforcement convoys sometime after dawn, and they've been ordered to hold this position at all costs. Whatever's in this industrial complex, it's important enough that they're willing to commit significant resources to capturing it intact. This information changed Sarah's tactical calculations considerably. If the enemy needed the facilities intact, they would be reluctant to use heavy bombardment or destructive weapons against her unit's position. But it also meant that time was running out. Once enemy reinforcements arrived, any hope of escape would disappear entirely. How long until these reinforcements arrive? She asked. Rodriguez checked his notes from the intercepted communications. Best estimate is 0600 hours, maybe 0700 if they encounter any delays on the approach route. Sarah looked at her watch. It was already 2200 hours, which gave her team less time than she had originally calculated. The tunnel operation would have to be accelerated, which increased the risk factors considerably, but might actually improve their chances if the enemy wasn't expecting such immediate action. Change of plans, she announced. We move the timeline up by 1 hour. I'll begin the tunnel approach at 2330 hours, with detonation scheduled for 0300 hours. That gives us a 3-hour window to evacuate our wounded and reach the extraction point before enemy reinforcements arrive. The soldiers around her absorbed this information with the professional calm of experienced combat veterans, but Sarah could see the concern in their eyes. Accelerating the timeline meant less preparation time, more improvisation, and higher probability of equipment failure or tactical mistakes. Sergeant Shin pulled her aside for a private conversation. Ma'am, I have to ask, what's our backup plan if the tunnel approach fails? If you get trapped down there or the explosives don't work as intended? Sarah considered the question seriously. There is no backup plan, Chun. This is our only realistic chance of neutralizing those tanks and creating an opportunity for evacuation. If I don't succeed, you'll have to make the best deal you can with the enemy commander for the safety of our people. And if you do succeed, what's our extraction route once the tanks are neutralized? She pointed to the map, showing a route that led through the industrial complex toward a river crossing about 2 kilometers from their current position. Once the tank positions are disrupted, we move fast and hard through the factory district. There's a bridge here that should still be intact, and beyond that, open terrain where we can link up with friendly forces. The plan was ambitious and dangerous, but it was built on solid tactical principles and careful intelligence gathering. Sarah had identified enemy weaknesses, available resources, and environmental factors that could be exploited to overcome their overwhelming disadvantage in conventional firepower. As the final hour of preparation began, Sarah gathered the chemical materials she would need for the improvised explosives. The industrial chemicals required careful handling. Some were corrosive, Others were reactive with moisture or heat, and all of them became extremely dangerous when mixed in the wrong proportions. Working by flashlight in a concealed area behind their defensive position, Sarah began the delicate process of creating shaped charges designed specifically for penetrating tank armor from below. Her engineering background proved invaluable as she calculated the precise amounts needed for maximum effectiveness while maintaining stability during transport through the tunnel system. The explosive devices had to be compact enough to carry through narrow maintenance tunnels, powerful enough to penetrate heavy armor, and reliable enough to detonate simultaneously despite being triggered by improvised timing mechanisms. Each charge represented a complex engineering challenge that had to be solved with limited materials and no opportunity for testing. "Ma'am," Private Johnson approached quietly. "The wounded soldiers want to contribute to the operation somehow." Phillips insists his leg wound won't prevent him from providing sniper cover, and Martinez says she can help with radio communications despite her shoulder injury. Sarah appreciated their dedication, but she couldn't allow wounded soldiers to participate in combat operations that required peak physical performance. Tell them their contribution is staying alive and ready for evacuation. If this operation succeeds, we're going to have to move fast, and I need them ready for rapid transport. As she completed the explosive preparation, Sarah conducted a final equipment check. Her load would include 6 improvised shaped charges, detonation devices with time delays, navigation tools for moving through dark tunnels, and basic survival equipment in case the tunnels became impassable. The total weight was manageable, but every item had to be essential since she couldn't afford to be slowed down by unnecessary gear. The tunnel access point she had chosen was located in the basement of a maintenance building about 400 meters from their current position. Reaching it would require crossing open ground under potential enemy observation, but the route she had planned used natural terrain features and industrial equipment for concealment. "Chun, show me the diversion plan one more time," Sarah requested, wanting to ensure perfect coordination between her underground approach and the surface distraction that would draw enemy attention away from the tunnel entrance. The sergeant outlined his strategy. At exactly 0230 hours, we'll initiate simulated radio traffic, suggesting we're planning a conventional assault on their left flank. 30 minutes later, we'll create movement and noise in that direction using our remaining smoke grenades and some small arms fire. Nothing aggressive enough to provoke a major response, but obvious enough to focus their attention on that sector. Perfect timing. That should give me the window I need to access the tunnels and begin placing charges. Sarah checked her watch again. Remember, if you don't hear explosions by 0315 hours, something has gone wrong, and you should begin surrender negotiations immediately. The weight of command had never felt heavier than it did in that moment. Sarah was asking her soldiers to trust her with their lives based on a plan that relied on improvised explosives, abandoned infrastructure, and precise timing under extreme stress. But conventional military doctrine had no solutions for their current tactical situation. As 02330 hours approached, Sarah made her final preparations. She blackened her face with mud to reduce visibility, secured all equipment to prevent noise during movement, and conducted one last review of the tunnel schematics by memory. Once she entered the underground system, she would be navigating by instinct and engineering knowledge rather than maps. Her soldiers gathered around for final instructions and what might be their last conversation. These were professional soldiers who understood the risks of military service, but this operation went far beyond normal combat expectations. Sarah was asking them to maintain discipline and hope while she disappeared underground for what could be several hours with no communication and uncertain chances of success. "Remember," she told them quietly, "if this works, you'll know it immediately. When those tanks go up, move fast toward the extraction point. Don't wait for me to rejoin the unit. Just get our wounded soldiers to safety. If I make it out of the tunnels, I'll catch up with you at the river crossing." Sergeant Chin stepped forward and offered a formal salute. "Ma'am, it's been an honor serving under your command. We'll be ready to move on your signal." Sarah returned the salute, then slipped over their defensive barrier and into the darkness. The industrial complex loomed ahead of her, filled with enemy soldiers and heavy armor that represented overwhelming conventional superiority. But beneath the surface, a network of forgotten tunnels offered one desperate chance to turn tactical disadvantage into strategic opportunity. Moving through the shadows between abandoned buildings, Sarah felt the familiar combination of fear and focus that characterized high-risk military operations. Her training had prepared her for conventional combat situations, but this mission required improvisation and technical skills that went far beyond standard military doctrine. The maintenance building that housed her chosen tunnel access point stood dark and silent among the industrial structures. Sarah approached it carefully, watching for any signs of enemy patrols or surveillance equipment. The building appeared unoccupied, but she knew that modern military forces often used passive monitoring devices that could detect movement or heat signatures. Inside the building, Sarah located the tunnel entrance exactly where the engineering diagrams had indicated. The access hatch was heavy and corroded, but it opened with careful pressure applied to avoid creating noise that might carry to enemy positions above ground. The tunnel system stretched ahead into complete darkness, filled with the echoes of dripping water and the distant rumble of machinery. Sarah checked her navigation compass one final time, then descended into the underground network that would either deliver her to striking range of the enemy tanks or become her tomb. Behind her, the maintenance building returned to silence, showing no evidence that anyone had passed through. Above ground, enemy tanks continued their vigilant watch over the industrial complex, their crews unaware that the tactical situation was about to change dramatically. In the tunnel system below, Sarah began the most dangerous phase of an already desperate mission, carrying enough explosive power to destroy several main battle tanks if she could deliver it to the right locations at precisely the right time. The tunnel system beneath the industrial complex was a maze of concrete passages, steam pipes, and electrical conduits that had been built to service the facility's infrastructure for decades. Sarah moved through the underground network by feel and memory, her flashlight providing only brief moments of illumination to check her navigation against the engineering diagrams she had memorized. The air in the tunnels was thick with humidity and the smell of old machinery oil, creating an oppressive atmosphere that made breathing difficult. Water dripped constantly from overhead pipes, and the sound of her footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space. Every few meters, she stopped to listen for any indication that her presence had been detected by enemy forces above ground. According to her calculations, the first tank position should be directly overhead after approximately 200 meters of tunnel navigation. Sarah counted her steps carefully, using the engineering landmarks indicated on the schematics to confirm her location. Steam distribution valves, electrical junction boxes, and pipe intersection points all matched the diagram she had studied, giving her confidence in the accuracy of her approach route. The improvised explosive devices she carried represented the culmination of her engineering knowledge and military experience. Each shaped charge was designed to focus the explosive force upward through the weakest points in the tunnel ceiling, creating penetrating jets of superheated metal that could breach tank armor from below. But the devices had to be positioned with mathematical precision to ensure effective penetration angles and maximum damage to critical tank systems. When Sarah reached the calculated position for the first tank, she used her flashlight to examine the tunnel ceiling carefully. The concrete structure showed stress fractures and signs of age, but it appeared solid enough to support the explosive devices without premature collapse. More importantly, she could hear the rumble of a diesel engine directly above her, confirming that an enemy tank was positioned exactly where the intelligence indicated. Placing the first explosive device required delicate work in cramped conditions. Sarah had to secure the shaped charge against the tunnel ceiling at precisely the right angle while connecting the detonation timer, and ensuring that the explosive force will be directed upward rather than dissipating harmlessly through the tunnel system. The timer mechanism was improvised from electronic components salvaged from their damaged equipment, calibrated to provide exactly the delay needed for coordinated detonation. As she worked, Sarah could hear voices and movement from above. The tank crew was maintaining normal operational procedures, conducting routine checks, and maintaining radio contact with their command structure. They had no indication that an enemy combatant was positioning explosives directly beneath their vehicle, preparing to turn their tactical advantage into a fatal vulnerability. The second tank position was located approximately 150 meters further through the tunnel system, requiring navigation through a series of sharp turns and elevation changes. Sarah moved carefully through this section, aware that any noise or disturbance might alert enemy personnel to her presence underground. The tunnel walls were lined with pipes and electrical cables that created obstacles and potential noise sources if she wasn't careful about her movement. When she reached the second position, Sarah discovered that the tunnel configuration was different from what the engineering diagrams had indicated. Decades of modifications and repairs had changed the overhead structure, creating additional support beams that would interfere with the optimal placement of her explosive device. She had to improvise a solution that maintained the effectiveness of the shaped charge while working around structural obstacles that hadn't been accounted for in her original planning. The modification process required additional time and created additional risk, but Sarah managed to position the second explosive device effectively. The detonation timer was synchronized with the first device to ensure simultaneous explosions that would maximize tactical surprise and prevent the remaining enemy tanks from taking defensive action. Above her, she could hear the second tank crew conducting what sounded like maintenance activities. Tools clinked against metal surfaces, and she heard the hydraulic whine of a turret rotating through its range of motion. The crew was clearly settled into their position for an extended period, confident in their tactical superiority and unaware of the threat developing beneath their feet. The third tank position required the most dangerous navigation through the tunnel system. Sarah had to cross under an area where enemy infantry maintained observation posts, and the tunnel route passed close to basement levels of buildings that might be occupied by hostile forces. Any unusual sound or disturbance in this section could expose the entire operation and result in her immediate capture or elimination. Moving through this critical area required extreme patience and careful timing. Sarah coordinated her movement with the sounds of activity above ground, using the noise of diesel engines and radio communications to mask any sound she might make while navigating the tunnel obstacles. The concrete passages were narrower in this section, forcing her to crawl through some areas while carrying the explosive devices and detonation equipment. When she finally reached the third tank position, Sarah discovered that this location presented the greatest technical challenge for explosive placement. The tunnel ceiling was reinforced with additional steel beams, and the tank above was positioned at an angle that would require precise calculation to ensure effective armor penetration. She spent precious minutes analyzing the structural configuration and modifying her explosive placement to compensate for these factors. The shape charge for this position had to be angled differently to account for the tank's orientation and the reinforced ceiling structure. Sarah used her engineering knowledge to calculate the optimal placement angle while working under time pressure and in cramped conditions that made precise work extremely difficult. The detonation timer was calibrated to synchronize with the other devices while accounting for the additional penetration time needed to breach the reinforced ceiling. As she completed the placement of the third explosive device, Sarah realized that she was ahead of schedule despite the technical challenges she had encountered. This gave her an opportunity to attempt placement of a fourth device under the enemy's reserve tank position, potentially eliminating another threat and further disrupting their tactical organization. The route to the fourth position required backtracking through part of the tunnel system and then navigating a section that wasn't clearly marked on the engineering diagrams. Sarah had to rely on her understanding of industrial infrastructure design and her sense of direction to locate the correct positioning for maximum effectiveness against the reserve tank. This section of the tunnel system showed more obvious signs of age and deterioration. Water damage had weakened some of the concrete surfaces, and she encountered areas where the ceiling had partially collapsed, creating obstacles that required careful navigation. The humidity was higher in this area, and she could smell the musty odor of long-standing water damage mixed with chemical residues from the abandoned processing operations. Despite these challenges, Sarah managed to locate a position that should be directly under the reserve tank location. The explosive device placement was more difficult due to the deteriorated ceiling structure, but she managed to secure the shaped charge effectively and connect the detonation timer to synchronize with the other devices. With 4 explosive devices now positioned throughout the tunnel system, Sarah began her return journey toward the tunnel exit point. The return trip was faster since she was familiar with the route and no longer needed to stop for device placement, but it was also more dangerous because her extended time underground increased the chances that her absence had been noticed by enemy forces. As she moved through the tunnel system toward the exit point, Sarah could hear increased activity above ground. Vehicle engines were running more frequently, and she heard the sound of personnel moving between positions. This could indicate normal operational procedures, but it might also suggest that the enemy had detected something unusual and was increasing their alert level. The timing of her operation had become critical. Sarah needed to exit the tunnel system and reach a safe distance before the explosive devices detonated. But she also needed to ensure that the detonation occurred while the enemy tanks were still in their established positions. If they moved before the explosives activated, the entire operation would fail and her unit would remain trapped without hope of escape. When Sarah finally reached the tunnel exit point, she discovered that the maintenance building above the access hatch was no longer unoccupied. She could hear voices and movement directly overhead, indicating that enemy personnel had established some kind of presence in the building. This created an immediate tactical problem. She couldn't exit through the planned route without risking detection and capture. The engineering diagrams indicated an alternative exit point about 50 meters further through the tunnel system, but reaching it would require additional navigation time and might put her too far from her unit's position when the explosives detonated. Sarah had to make a quick decision about whether to risk detection at the primary exit or attempt to reach the alternative route under time pressure. She chose to remain at the primary exit point and wait for an opportunity when the overhead activity decreased. This was a calculated risk that could result in her being trapped underground when the explosives detonated, but it offered the best chance of reaching her unit's position in time to coordinate the evacuation. After 15 minutes of waiting, the activity above ground decreased enough for Sarah to attempt exiting through the primary access point. She opened the tunnel hatch carefully, listening for any immediate signs of enemy presence in the building. When she heard nothing but distant voices from outside the structure, she climbed out of the tunnel system and began moving toward the building exit. The maintenance building was now being used as a temporary storage area for enemy equipment and supplies. Sarah had to navigate carefully around military gear and communication equipment while avoiding detection. Her blackened face and dark clothing helped conceal her presence, but any direct contact with enemy personnel would expose the entire operation. As she reached the building exit, Sarah could see the enemy tank positions clearly illuminated by moonlight and the glow from their operational lighting. The tanks were exactly where she had expected them to be, positioned for maximum tactical advantage, but unknowingly sitting directly above the explosive devices she had just finished positioning. The detonation timers were counting down towards 0300 hours, giving Sarah approximately 30 minutes to return to her unit's position and prepare for the coordinated assault that would follow the destruction of the enemy armor. But first, she had to cross 400 meters of potentially hostile territory without being detected by enemy patrols or observation posts. Sarah began her return journey using the same concealment techniques that had brought her to the tunnel access point. Moving between abandoned industrial equipment and using natural shadows for cover, she made steady progress toward her unit's defensive position. The sound of diesel engines and Normal military activity provided audio camouflage, but she remained constantly alert for any signs that her presence had been detected. Halfway back to her unit's position, Sarah encountered an enemy patrol conducting a routine security check of the industrial area. 3 soldiers with night vision equipment were methodically searching between buildings, following a pattern that would bring them directly across her planned route. She had to find immediate concealment and wait for them to pass, using precious time that brought her closer to the detonation deadline. The patrol moved slowly and professionally, checking potential hiding places and maintaining communication with their command post. Sarah pressed herself against the side of a concrete structure, controlling her breathing and remaining absolutely motionless while the enemy soldiers passed within 10 meters of her position. The night vision equipment they carried could detect movement or heat signatures, making concealment extremely challenging. After the patrol moved past her position, Sarah continued toward her unit with increased urgency. The detonation timers were now counting down to less than 15 minutes, and she needed to reach her soldiers in time to coordinate their immediate response to the tank explosions. If she wasn't in position to guide the evacuation, the destruction of the enemy armor might not translate into tactical advantage. When Sarah finally reached the perimeter of her unit's defensive position, she gave the agreed-upon recognition signal and waited for acknowledgement before approaching the main position. Sergeant Chun immediately moved to assist her over the barrier, his relief evident despite the professional calm he maintained. "Ma'am, thank God you made it back," Chun whispered. "We were starting to worry about the timeline. Is everything in position?" Sarah nodded grimly. 4 devices, synchronized detonation in 12 minutes. "Are our people ready to move immediately when the tanks go up?" "Affirmative. Wounded soldiers are prepared for rapid transport, and we've got our route to the extraction point planned and rehearsed. What do you need from us during the actual attack?" Sarah checked her watch one final time. "When those explosions happen, we move fast and hard toward the river crossing. No stopping to assess damage or engage remaining enemy forces. Our job is to get out of here alive, not to continue fighting." As the final minutes counted down toward the moment that would determine whether their desperate gamble would succeed or fail, Sarah prepared herself mentally for the chaos that would follow the detonation of her improvised explosive devices. At exactly 0300 hours, the industrial complex erupted in a sequence of devastating explosions that shattered the night silence and transformed the tactical situation completely. Sarah's improvised explosive devices detonated with mathematical precision, sending superheated metal jets upward through the tunnel ceilings and into the bellies of 4 enemy tanks simultaneously. The first explosion lifted the lead tank completely off the ground, its massive weight becoming airborne for several seconds before crashing back down in a twisted wreck of burning metal and scattered debris. The shaped charge had penetrated the armor precisely where Sarah had calculated, igniting the ammunition storage and creating a secondary explosion that illuminated the entire area with brilliant orange flames. The second and third explosions followed within milliseconds, destroying the flank-covering tanks with equal effectiveness. The crews had no warning and no opportunity to escape as the explosive forces penetrated their supposedly impregnable armor from the one direction they had never considered vulnerable. The synchronized timing prevented any coordinated response from the remaining enemy forces. The fourth explosion, targeting the reserve tank, was the most spectacular of all. The device had been positioned to maximize structural damage to the surrounding area, and when it detonated, it brought down part of a concrete wall that had been supporting enemy infantry positions. The blast created a cascade of falling debris that further disrupted enemy defensive arrangements. Sarah felt the ground shake beneath her feet as the explosions rippled through the industrial complex. Even from her position 400 meters away, the heat and light from the burning tanks was intense enough to create temporary blindness for anyone looking directly at the destruction. The sound was overwhelming, a combination of explosive detonations, secondary ammunition explosions, and the grinding crash of collapsing metal and concrete. Move! 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 Sarah shouted to her soldiers, leading them over their defensive barrier and toward their planned evacuation route. The destruction of the enemy armor had created exactly the window of opportunity they needed, but they had to exploit it immediately before the surviving enemy forces could reorganize and establish new defensive positions. Sergeant Shun helped carry Private Phillips, whose leg wound made rapid movement difficult, while Corporal Wagner assisted Rodriguez despite her own shoulder injury. The wounded soldiers understood that this was their only chance for survival and pushed themselves beyond normal physical limits to maintain the pace needed for successful evacuation. As they moved through the industrial complex, Sarah could see the devastating effectiveness of her improvised explosive devices. The 4 enemy tanks were completely destroyed, their hulks burning fiercely and creating thick black smoke that obscured visibility throughout the area. Enemy infantry were running between buildings, shouting orders, and tried to establish communication with their command structure, but their tactical organization had been shattered along with their armored support. The route Sarah had planned took them through areas that were now chaotic with confused enemy personnel and burning debris. But this chaos also provided concealment, as the surviving enemy forces were focused on assessing damage and treating their own wounded rather than maintaining organized patrols or observation posts. Moving through the smoke and flames, Sarah's unit encountered scattered groups of enemy soldiers who were too disoriented to mount effective resistance. Most were focused on escaping the immediate area of destruction rather than engaging in combat operations. The few who attempted to challenge the passing American soldiers were quickly discouraged by disciplined return fire that demonstrated superior training and coordination. After 20 minutes of rapid movement through the industrial complex, Sarah's unit reached the perimeter of the facility and began approaching the river crossing that represented their route to safety. Behind them, the burning tanks continued to provide a massive column of smoke and flame that was visible for kilometers in every direction. But as they approached the river, Sarah realized that their tactical situation was more complex than she had anticipated. The destruction of the enemy armor had indeed created an opportunity for escape, but it had also attracted the attention of the reinforcement convoys that had been approaching the area. She could see vehicle lights in the distance, moving rapidly toward the industrial complex from multiple directions. "Chun, how long until we reach the bridge?" she asked, checking her watch and calculating their remaining time before enemy reinforcements arrived in strength. 15 minutes at our current pace, ma'am. But the wounded soldiers are slowing us down more than we anticipated. Phillips is losing blood, and Rodriguez is having balance problems from his concussion. Sarah made the difficult decision to prioritize speed over caution. "We push harder, carry the wounded soldiers if necessary, but we have to reach that bridge before enemy reinforcements cut off our escape route." As they approached the river crossing, Sarah could see that the bridge was intact, but potentially defended. Enemy forces might have anticipated that any escaping American soldiers would use this obvious route and position personnel to intercept them. But with reinforcements approaching from behind and limited alternative routes available, they had no choice but to attempt the crossing. The bridge spanning the river was an old industrial structure designed to support heavy equipment moving between facilities. It was approximately 200 meters long and offered little cover if enemy forces had established defensive positions on the far side. Sarah used her binoculars to scan the opposite bank, looking for any signs of hostile activity or prepared positions. "I don't see obvious defensive preparations," she reported to Chun, "but that doesn't mean they're not there. We'll have to move fast across the bridge and be prepared for contact on the far side." As Sarah's unit approached the bridge, they encountered the first organized resistance since escaping the industrial complex. A small group of enemy soldiers had established a checkpoint at the near end of the bridge, apparently positioned to monitor river crossings and report on any unusual activity. But they were clearly not prepared for armed contact with a full military unit. The brief firefight that followed was intense, but quickly resolved in favor of Sarah's more experienced soldiers. The enemy checkpoint was eliminated with disciplined small arms fire that prevented them from alerting other forces to the American unit's location. But the engagement had used precious time and ammunition while revealing their position to any enemy personnel within hearing range of the gunfire. Crossing the bridge itself was the most vulnerable phase of their escape. Sarah's unit was completely exposed during the 2-minute movement across the structure, with no cover available if enemy forces engaged them from defensive positions on either side of the river. But they reached the far bank without encountering additional resistance, suggesting that enemy forces were still primarily focused on responding to the destruction at the industrial complex. Once across the river, Sarah led her unit into terrain that offered better concealment and multiple route options for continuing their escape. Rolling hills covered with scattered vegetation provided natural hiding places, and the network of farm roads gave them flexibility in choosing their path toward friendly territory. But their tactical situation remained precarious. Enemy reinforcements were converging on the area, and it would only be a matter of time before organized search operations began attempting to locate and eliminate the unit responsible for destroying main battle tanks. Sarah needed to put as much distance as possible between her soldiers, and the industrial complex before daylight made concealment more difficult. After 2 hours of rapid movement through the countryside, Sarah called a brief halt to assess their situation and treat the wounded soldiers who had been pushed beyond their physical limits during the escape. Private Phillips was losing consciousness from blood loss, and Rodriguez was showing signs of severe concussion that required immediate medical attention. "Chun, we need to reach friendly lines within the next 4 hours," Sarah announced after checking her map and calculating distances to known American positions. "Our wounded soldiers can't maintain this pace much longer, and enemy search operations will intensify once they finish assessing the damage at the complex." The sergeant studied the map carefully, noting terrain features and potential routes towards safety. "Ma'am, there's a small town about 8 kilometers ahead with a medical clinic. If we can reach it, we might be able to get emergency treatment for Phillips and Rodriguez while contacting headquarters for extraction support." Sarah considered this option, but she was concerned about exposing civilian medical personnel to military dangers. Enemy forces might retaliate against anyone who assisted American soldiers, and the town could become a target for search operations. But without medical attention, her wounded soldiers might not survive the journey to friendly lines. "We'll approach the town carefully and assess the situation before committing to seeking medical assistance," she decided. "If there are any signs of enemy presence or hostile surveillance, we continue toward our original extraction point regardless of the medical risks." As dawn began to break over the countryside, Sarah's unit continued their movement toward potential safety. Behind them, thick black smoke still rose from the industrial complex where 4 enemy tanks had been destroyed by a single soldier's determination to protect her people. The impossible mission had succeeded, but the full cost of their tactical victory was still being calculated. During their approach to the small town, Sarah reflected on the events of the past 12 hours. The ambush that had trapped her unit had been based on intelligence failures and enemy planning that suggested larger strategic problems in their area of operations. But her soldiers had demonstrated the kind of professional competence and personal courage that could overcome overwhelming tactical disadvantages when led by someone willing to risk everything for their survival. The improvised explosive attack on the enemy tanks had required technical skills far beyond standard military training, but it had also required the kind of leadership that accepted personal responsibility for impossible situations. Sarah had been prepared to die underground in those tunnels if it meant giving her soldiers a chance to escape and survive. As they reached the outskirts of the small town, Sarah could see that it appeared peaceful and unoccupied by military forces from either side. The medical clinic was clearly marked and showed signs of recent activity. But she remained cautious, knowing that appearances could be deceptive and that enemy forces might be using civilian facilities for their own purposes. "Chun, take Wagner and Rodriguez to the clinic for medical assessment, she ordered. I'll establish a perimeter with the remaining soldiers and maintain communication watch. If there's any sign of trouble, we evacuate immediately and continue toward the extraction point. The medical treatment for her wounded soldiers was successful, with local medical personnel providing emergency care that stabilized their conditions for continued transport. The clinic staff asked no questions about their military activities and simply focused on treating injuries that clearly required immediate attention. Within 2 hours, Sarah's unit was ready to continue their movement toward friendly lines. The wounded soldiers were in stable condition, and the brief rest had restored some energy to the entire unit. But enemy search operations were intensifying in the area, and they could hear helicopter activity in the distance that suggested large-scale pursuit efforts. The final phase of their escape required crossing 15 kilometers of open terrain while avoiding enemy patrols and air surveillance. Sarah chose a route that used natural terrain features for concealment while maintaining steady progress toward the coordinates where they expected to find American forces. As they moved through the countryside, Sarah could see evidence of the larger military situation that had led to their ambush. Enemy supply lines, defensive positions, and communication installations indicated a major operation that went far beyond the tactical engagement at the industrial complex. Her unit had stumbled into the edge of a much larger strategic confrontation. But for now, her responsibility was simply getting her soldiers to safety and reporting the intelligence they had gathered about enemy capabilities and intentions. The successful destruction of 4 enemy tanks with improvised explosives would be analyzed by military intelligence specialists who could assess its implications for future tactical operations. When Sarah's unit finally reached friendly lines at 1400 hours, they were met by American forces who had been monitoring radio traffic about the destruction at the industrial complex. The tactical victory had already become part of the larger military situation, but for Sarah and her soldiers, it represented something more personal. The successful completion of an impossible mission that had brought all of them home alive. As they were processed through the debriefing procedures that followed any combat engagement, Sarah realized that her improvised tunnel attack would probably be studied and analyzed by military professionals for years to come. But the most important result was visible in the faces of her soldiers, who had survived a situation that should have been fatal through determination, skill, and leadership that refused to accept defeat. The industrial complex continued to burn in the distance, its smoke column marking the site where conventional tactical wisdom had been overcome by unconventional thinking, and the kind of personal courage that defined the best traditions of military service. 4 enemy tanks had been destroyed by a single commander who understood that protecting her soldiers was worth any personal risk, and that impossible missions could sometimes succeed when led by someone who refused to consider failure as an acceptable option.